Bien, mesdames, messieurs.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've just finished the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting in this very inspiring place, the cities of Dinard and Saint Malo. Since the mayor of Dinard and the team is here, since the prefect of the region is also here, you're all here, I wanted to thank you personally, Madam Prefect, local authorities, the mayors of Dinard and also Saint Malo value you for the very warm welcome you have given us. I'm doing this on my own personal behalf. Brittany had to be able to live up to its name, and I think it did, but also on behalf of my colleagues who were very touched by the welcome they received. You even managed to arrange excellent weather for the second day. The first day I said, using old local saying, they said rainy G7, happy G7, rhymes in French. I think that was the case. But in any case, the goal of this meeting was to make commitments of a concrete and operational nature on the priorities we have set forth at the request of the President of the Republic to fight against inequalities, reduce threats, and strengthen democracy. And these goals were met. All of our working sessions led to declarations on the way states should behave in cyberspace, prevention of sexual violence in conflict, the prevention of trafficking, which helps terrorist groups in the Sahel. You've already received our joint declaration on Libya yesterday, and we finally approved a rather lengthy final communique, which you should receive soon if you don't have it yet. It's a very complete document, and which reflects our views on the main international crises we confront. You know that the President of the Republic considers that the fight against inequalities is the main goal of our G7 presidency because the worsening of all of these inequalities in the world and our societies is one of the main causes of present conflicts, of violence, and of the length of these conflicts. And it requires a concerted dealing with in order to arrive at worldwide peace and stability. We had a working session yesterday about the role of women in conflict environments. It was concluded with the adoption of an ambitious roadmap on the fight against sexual violence, which calls for support by G7 countries for the fund created by Dr. Mukwege, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and which should also allow us to create an early warning system when rape is used as an instrument of war. Talking now about main security-related measures, our exchanges concern the fight against terrorism, but in particular its links to organized crime. And here we adopted a joint declaration concerning the fight against illicit trafficking in drugs, weapons, and human beings in the Sahel, which benefits terrorist groups. The G7 countries also committed themselves to stepping up their support for African peacekeeping operations. That was part of yesterday evening's meeting. And to that end, I should like to thank the President of the African Union, Mr. Moussa Faki, to have come yesterday to Saint Malo specially to present the African Union's viewpoint and to share with us his rich experience. On that occasion, we also mentioned the difficulties and the needs of the G5 Sahel force. We mentioned ways and means for strengthening democracy, facing up to the consequences of the digital revolution and practices of interference. In the G7 and in the EU, as we saw at the last European Council, we need to prove that we are able to prevent attempts to interfere, to eliminate attempts to obstruct the freedom of the press, and effectively to regulate manipulations of information without renouncing the principles which define us. This was the meaning of the Information and Democracy Initiative, which we launched together with our partner, Reporters Without Boundaries. I had the opportunity to represent this initiative to my partners, and the supporting states of this initiative will be signing a partnership document during the Biarritz summit. And this was also the meaning of Christia Friedman's and Jeremy Hunt's launch of an initiative yesterday for media freedom, sponsored by Amal Clooney. And we decided that we would give strong impetus to this area and to twin the two initiatives, if you will, to give each of them more strength. This will be expressed in the shape of a big forum in the UK in July. We finally also adopted a declaration which means to encourage behavior of states in cyberspace, which can only be an area where there is no prevalent legal system. The idea is to exchange best practices here so that cyberspace becomes an open, free, safe, and secure space. Those were the things that I wanted to tell you on behalf of the G7. And as chair, I have finished my remarks on France's behalf saying there is a very long, positive, complete communiqué, which does not mean that this communiqué does not identify some divergences of opinion, even if we do agree on most things. We wanted to be entirely transparent in the communiqué and also say that on two subjects in particular, the situation in the Middle East, and specifically the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the one hand, and then our appreciation of the method to be used in terms of our relations with Iran, we have well-known divergences. But that shouldn't stop us from saying that we do agree on the rest and having a shared communiqué which spells out the points of agreement and disagreement. We felt this was the right approach because we want the G7 presidency which France holds to be realistic and constructive, and we will continue to use this approach during the 6 upcoming ministerial meetings we will have between now and the Biarritz summit at the end of August. The next important dates will be in particular concerning my own activities. Development and Education Ministers, I will be chairing that meeting in Paris on the 4th and 5th of July in the run-up to the Biarritz summit. This way of proceeding today, I think, has showed us that we can get targeted commitments, concrete commitments, and that we should show creativity at all times as we develop a culture of compromise and dialogue. Because very deeply, we cannot simply be spectators of the rolling up of multilateralism. Essential decisions need to be made for peace and security internationally, and those decisions can only be collective ones. Our ambition, therefore, is also to help those who want to go further, all of us together, and we want to be the vector of revitalization of multilateralism. We also brought together this morning the founders of what we call the Alliance for Multilateralism, Germany, Canada, France, and Japan, whose goal is to bring together major democracies who wish to be in the vanguard of multilateralism. We had, on occasion, Heiko Maas and myself to present this project in New York during the consecutive chairing of the Security Council by France and Germany at the beginning of this week, and we had the opportunity to take that up again here, together with our colleague Tara Kono and our colleague Chrystia Freeland, who is Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada. Those were the few comments I wished to make, and I am ready to answer a few questions. Not too many, but some.
collègues journalistes, 4 questions.
4 questions for journalist colleagues. Thank you. Sabine Rao from Channel 1 in Germany. Minister, could you explain what are the measures that you suggest to stabilize the situation in Libya? In Libya, we know what needs to be done. Yesterday evening, we set forth a communiqué together with no difficulty. There's one basic principle, which is that in Libya, there will not be a military victory. The solution can only be a political one. The political solution will first of all involve calling a national conference, and then an electoral process which will include all Libyans, both to elect a president and legislative elections as well. A national conference would have as its goal to implement all these constitutional measures that would allow these elections to take place. Now, for all of this to happen in a calm setting, we would need many elements of the present situation to stop and different players to restrain themselves. And initiatives taken by the United Nations and their special envoy, Mr. Salamé, but the Secretary General of the UN, who was in Libya precisely when there was this sudden military onslaught that you have referred to. This process needs to be completed. This is what France wishes. This is what the members of the G7 wish as well. It's also what Italy wants. France and Italy are on the same page here. We showed at the La Celle Saint-Cloud meeting, which was initiated by President Macron, where President Sarraj and Marshal Haftar met for the first time in such a meeting. They had also met in Palermo in a meeting which I went to, hosted by Italy some months ago. So we're really on the same page. Things need to go on unfolding in the way I have described. Libyan institutions need to be developed, violence must be renounced, and an electoral process must begin. And all Libyans need to understand that, and all the players need to understand that. I think we're not very far from an agreement so that everything may conclude satisfactorily. In Abu Dhabi, at the end of February or beginning of March, there was also an agreement between the two interested parties. And then that went wrong as soon as they got back home. But now they have to overcome the difficulties of the past in the interest of the Libyan people, because the Libyan people, I think, have had enough of this situation of violence, which has lasted for several years now, and they aspire to political clarification. The proof of that is the number of Libyans that have registered to vote and act in such a way that political processes overcome military rivalries. And the whole international community is behind them, of course. Good afternoon, Minister. Abdelhadi from France 24. Still on Libya. Prominent people from the city of Luta, Abdraman Souarti, who is the president of the Council of State in Libya, publicly accused France, saying it had been duplicitous in Libya, and saying that France condemns the present military escalation, but at the same time, it's helping Marshal Haftar militarily. How would you answer that? I know him very well. And if he needs to support the process which is being started by the United Nations, and he needs to say that, and he needs to do that. And if you see him, you can tell him so. I hope so too. Good afternoon, Minister. Christian Akbauer, Financial Africa. To stay in Africa for a bit, Mr. Faki came to the meeting, but you seem to say that during the African dinner yesterday, you talked basically about the G5 Sahel and better management of the funds which they are meant to receive. African security is much broader than that as a subject. Could you perhaps tell us whether, above and beyond the G5 Sahel, there were other discussions? No, I didn't say we only talked about the G5 Sahel. We talked about the whole security situation in Africa, and I do confirm that. But the point of Moussa Fakir coming to this G7 meeting, which is the first time such a thing has happened, was to discuss the African concept of the African peace operations. We are convinced that the best form of security in Africa is one that is guaranteed by African forces. And the African Union, in the context of its reforms, has taken initiatives which seem to us positive, and we said that to him yesterday, and that is in the minutes and the final communique. We propose an African peace initiative with African forces, with a shared mandate from the African Union and the UN Security Council, and that would be a good vector for having Africans guarantee their own security. It's not just a question of principle, because the African Union has also taken the decision to create a special fund to finance these operations, which is presently being financed, and he told us all about his doctrine, which is applicable to all conflict situations, and that was the deep underlying reason for his being here, and we validated that. You'll find it in the minutes. It was a very important point of our discussion.
Encore deux questions.
Two more questions? Good afternoon, Minister. Soraki Ito. I work for the Asahi Shimbun, a Japanese daily. I would have two questions. First of all, during your meetings with Taro Koto from Japan, how did you discuss the decision of Mr. Carlos Ghosn? And secondly, can you tell us whether Brexit was mentioned at the G7 ministerial, and what is your position concerning the proposal made by Theresa May to have an extension up to the end of June? Well, of course, we mentioned the case of Mr. Carlos Ghosn to Taro Kono, my colleague. I told him two things. I seem to have some competition here. Hang on. I told him two things. First of all, that France totally respects the sovereignty and independence of the Japanese justice system, and secondly, our attachment to the respect of the presumption of innocence and the full application of consular protection. That was the issue that we discussed during our meeting. We didn't talk about Brexit. It wasn't on the G7 agenda either. Jeremy Hunt did take the time to come for the whole day yesterday to participate in our work. You know what France's position is. I don't need to reiterate it here. It is time for the situation to end. The European Council made a clear decision on March 21st. If there's a new extension, because that would seem to be Mrs. May's request, the UK would need to present a plan which would justify that request for extension. And we would also have to have in that plan some anticipation of clear and credible political support. We might imagine that Mrs. May will present such a thing to the European Council on April 10th. This coming week, because these were the conditions that had been set forth by the European Council last March 21st. That said, we cannot go on living perpetually waiting for Brexit to happen. At some point, there has to be an exit. And I think that we really need for the British authorities, for the British Parliament, to realize that the European Union is not going to want to go on exhausting itself over the random occurrences that characterize British domestic policy. We deeply regret Britain's departure. We aren't the ones who asked for this vote. But now the British need to tell us quite quickly how they intend to find their way out of this crisis. Minister, good afternoon. I'm Ashwari from France 24. We talking about the British and Brexit, and then the Americans who sent Michael Pompeo as deputy. So the question on the way the G7 is working and the whole issue of multilateralism seems to be an open one. You were talking about an alliance with 4 countries today. Is that the answer, to have a G4 inside the G7? Oh, no, the G7 works, not at all. Last year, there was the end of the G7 for the heads of state and government at Charlevoix, which didn't go so well, but the G7 for the ministers of foreign affairs here in Dinard went very well indeed. I've said that we have observed something we already knew perfectly well, and in spite of the bracing sea air in Dinard, we were not able to overcome here 2 points of divergence, which I've already mentioned with my American colleague. But the discussion with all G7 members was very fluid, very constructive, and very positive and indeed agreeable. We're very positive about the content. Multilateralism is something else. And I said just now, and I'm saying it again now, that what we see is that the basis of what has been done by multilateralism since the end of the Second World War, both in terms of security in the United Nations, but also the WTO and trade and education, everything that revolves around international organizations, created largely after World War II, these bases are being chipped away at, are crumbling. And the challenges we are facing today are at least as great as those which our predecessors had to confront in the 1950s. And we agreed, therefore, with my German colleague, because we share the same impressions, that we wanted to bring together those who want to revitalize multilateralism, give it greater strength, and act as a motor or a vector vis-à-vis those who like the status quo or those who like unraveling it. And that was the sense of the discussions we had this morning with our colleagues from Canada and Japan. It's also the point of the discussions we have had this week in New York with representatives of India, Mexico, the UK. Because the UK was not represented this morning by Mr. Hunt, who had to go back. Other countries, South Korea, Australia. I haven't got the whole list to hand right here, but many democracies that want to move along those same lines. South Africa, not to forget them. And to our stakeholders in relaunching multilateralism to face the present crises. How can you possibly deal with a migratory crisis, a migrant crisis, a digital crisis such as we have before us, without mentioning terrorism, by sticking to the status quo or by backtracking? It's simply not possible. And that's why, on a Franco-German initiative basis, we want to pick up the torch of multilateralism and breathe new life into it. We want to be the locomotive of a new form of multilateralism. Thank you very much.
Temps pour des vacances.
Time for vacation.